We're all set? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Town of Nantucket Finance Committee meeting for Monday, February 10th. The meeting is called to order. Is there any public comment for any items that are not on our agenda tonight? Okay. Hearing none, we're just going to go ahead and skip over to number 5 on our agenda, which is a public hearing on warrant articles. And this is an opportunity for any citizen to give comment and to answer questions from the committee for all the items, all the articles on our warrant. And what we'd like to do, I will call all the articles starting with number 1, but unless there are specific comments about zoning, since the planning board is going to have 3 public hearings for zoning articles, I will just bypass those unless someone has a specific comment on any. Okay? And also, before I forget, I'd like to introduce members of the committee, starting on my far right. This is Christy Kickham, Steve Morey, Cliff Williams, Tim Savarino, Craig Sperry, and John Tiffany. David Worth and Jim Kelly will not be attending today. So with that in mind, I'd like to open the public hearing. And I'm just going to call out Article 1, and if anybody wants to speak, if anyone wants to speak, please come up to either one of the microphones on the right or left, and just, I'll ask your name, and take it from there. So we'll go ahead and start with Article 1. Article 2. Article 3. Article 4, Article 5, Article 6, Article 7, Article 8, Article 9, Article 10, Article 11, Article 12, Article 13, Article 14, Article 15, Article 16, Article 17, Article 18, Article 19, Article 20, Article 21, Article 22, Article 23, Article 24, Article 25, Article 26, Article 27, Article 28, Article 29, Article 30, Article 31, Article 32.
Chairman.
Yes, sir. Article 32. And please just go up to the mic and just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Curtis Barnes. I'm the sponsor of this article. I have met with the committee once before and discussed the article and my purpose in submitting it. We've seen a lot of evidence this winter of the expenses that we're going through on the sewers as well as water. We are anticipating significant increases in the cost of sewers as the plant expands in Surfside. My feeling is, if you looked at your water bill as I have, my sewer fee is double my water bill. And it seems to me that a more appropriate distribution of sewer fees, which benefit the entire community, is to put a portion of what is now tied to the water use on the general tax roll. I am aware that there are people who have septic systems and wells who have a different arrangement in paying for the sewer fees. So the article that I'm proposing is that we look at reallocating the cost of the sewer fees that are included in the water bill and putting a portion of that on the general tax roll.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions from the committee?
I just have a question.
Sure, yes, go ahead.
When you just said that a portion of it on the general tax roll, so you'd basically,
Well, if you look at the article,
but just take the total, the debt service, or take the bill and just designate it as part of a tax versus a bill?
actually, I would look for your wisdom on that, but what I'm saying is right now, when my water bill is $30 and my sewer allocation is $66 against 30, it seems disproportionate to me, and it seems to me that we have grown significantly since we started the formula for paying for the sewers, and I think that a greater portion of it should go on the general tax roll.
Any other questions? Oh, Tim, go ahead.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman, but a comment.
Mhm.
I would just comment that I couldn't agree more than the submitter. I've been sounding this alarm bell for quite some time from the beginning, and I agree that there's a huge inequity, and I appreciate the submitters trying again to get this squared away.
Hope we have a good discussion at town.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments on Article 32?
Get a question here.
Oh, question, yes, sir.
You're talking about, you pick 50%. What was the basis of picking 50%?
Well, I thought it would be a reasonable approach to say that if my sewer fee is double my water bill, I would say to make the sewer fee equal to the water bill would not be unreasonable. There is a reason for you're doing that, but I do think that as the sewer costs and expenses have grown, that a greater portion should be out. I'd be very happy if 100% went on or two-thirds went on the general tax roll, but I'm trying to get a discussion started so we take a look at what we're doing and why we're doing it today, as opposed to 10, 15 years ago. So I just picked 50% as a number that would be worth discussing. Be very happy if you would recommend two-thirds or something like that. Okay?
Okay.
That's
Thank
fine.
you. Any further questions on Article 32? Okay. Article 33. Article 34. Okay. Article 35 starts zoning articles, so unless anyone has any specific comments, we're going to go ahead and skip to Article 69, which is a bylaw amendment. Oh, wait a minute, that's zoning too. Hold on, excuse me. Article 71, which is a bylaw amendment, and it's a Board of Sewer Commissioners / Town Sewer District map changes for South Pasture Lane area. Any comments on Article 71? Okay. Article 72. Article 73. Article 74. Article 75. Article 76. Article 77. Article 78. Article 79. Article 80. Article 81. Okay. Now, Article 82 starts the home rule petitions, and I believe the ones Lisa's coming up are ones that have already been approved from previous town meetings, and will just, a positive vote at this upcoming town meeting will just continue the process of attempting to get these passed. So Article 82, which is the Airport Fuel Revolving Fund. Article 83. Article 84. Oh, yes, sir. Article 84? Thank you.
Does this work if you want it on the mic?
Yeah, if you could, being that
Is this one working?
That's working good.
Gentlemen, Article 84, I voted, I'm not speaking on behalf of the board, I'm speaking as, I'm obviously a board member, but I've been following this article. This has to do with the nature of the membership of the Community Preservation Act Committee, and I specifically did not support this when the board adopted the warrant. I think a simple way to look at this is that the state has a recommended way to structure the Community Preservation Act Committee. I think it makes a great deal of sense. I don't think the town any longer needs to ask for a special act to have a different configuration than that supported by the state enabling legislation. So I would ask you not to support submitting Article 84 as a home rule petition to the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on 84? All right. 85. Article 86. Article 87. Article 88. And, yes, sir. This is actually a citizens' warrant article, which is new for this year. And these begin, there will be a few of those. Thank you.
Curtis Barnes again. Right now, if we want to amend the HDC in any way, shape, or form, we have to go to the legislature and worry our way through a year or two of maybe and what if. All other HDCs in the Commonwealth, about 100 of them, function under the newer section that was introduced after the original HDC Act in 1955, and that is Section 40C, which allows a two-thirds vote of town meeting, just like you do with zoning, to change your HDC Act to meet the needs of the community. I am suggesting that we do endorse the change to 40C so that we bring tighter control or the ability to move more flexibly back to our community.
Thank you. Any other comment, questions from the committee? Tim?
Kurt, I would ask, have you had any discussion with the existing HDC with regard to, and I know that's a controversial question, but do they support this, or do you have any feedback from former members that kind of...
Well, if you recall, last year I submitted a similar article. I was asked to withdraw that article at town meeting because the selectmen were going to establish a work group and a study group like we did with the town manager study that resulted in what I consider to be a very positive change. Nothing happened until October, and then there were committees appointed. I sit in with the work group that is meeting again this Wednesday with Linda Williams and Steve Cohen. So this particular question has not come up. Right now, their effort is adapting the forms so that you can fill them out on a computer. That doesn't address the basic issue, it seems to me, that how we got there and how we're going to move forward as a town with more flexibility to achieve our goals. So frankly, unless there's something I don't know going on, I've heard no feedback specifically to this. I think my good friend Linda Williams is not in favor of changing too much at this time. And quite frankly, my objective, again, is to get this on town meeting floor. I think it's time we took a look at what we're doing. And going to the legislature and waiting a year or two and maybe is not a good way to run business. And if 98 out of 100 other HDCs in this Commonwealth function well under 40C, I think we should take a very serious look at it.
You got another question?
I just want to follow up.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Well, Kurt, the only reason I ask is I knew of the committee being constituted by the selectmen. So I was just curious if they were going to be ready for the Finance Committee with a recommendation as opposed to going around them. That's what I was looking for.
Quite frankly, I don't know I sit in as an observer. I am not a member of that committee, but it's a small group. There are only 5 or 6 people there, so they're courteousy enough to let me sit at the table and offer a comment once in a while. But I have heard no discussion whatsoever. Andrew may have some useful information about that, but at this point I have no indication that they're going to bring anything like this to the town meeting.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Any other questions or comments on Article 88? Okay, thank you. Article 89, I'm assuming.
That's me again.
Waiting on. Okay.
No
The floor
sense
is
in
yours.
sitting down.
That's right.
In 1955, the First Enabling Act provided that the selectmen appoint the members of the HDC. When the act was amended in 1970 from what I understand to be the Tristram's debacle or situation, for whatever reason, the amendment provided that HDC members would be elected. I've taken a look at the majority of town boards, and as far as I can determine, there are some 20 boards or more where the selectmen make the appointments. My feeling is we had a very good model in the case of the Board of Health, where we did appoint well-qualified people who had an interest in the health questions of the town to serve on that board, and it's functioned very, very well. So that, to me, is a model that I look at as being effective. One of the concerns expressed was that if the selectmen appoint the board, that any objections or disputes are referred back to the selectmen. That is, the selectmen are now the adjudicating body of the appointing body. However, under 40C, if that's passed, any disputes are referred to the Regional Planning Commission, not to the selectmen. And then if there's still a dispute from the Regional Planning Commission, then it goes directly to Superior Court. So in a way, both the 40C article and the appointing article, to me, have some integration. But I do believe one of the things that struck me recently is the Dan Wolf decision, where he was found not in conflict, not unable to serve as a senator or to run for governor, because he wasn't directly involved in negotiating his contracts with Massport. And it strikes me that we have, a few years ago, disqualified, interested and highly qualified people who would serve on the HDC because they sit in front of the HDC, architects and engineers and people like that. I would hope that the model of the Dan Wolf ruling might trickle down so that we could appoint people who are interested and qualified. And I think there are people who will step up to serve. The elective process in Nantucket is not a fun thing. I've been there a couple of times. I enjoyed it, but a lot of people just don't want to go through the rigors of standing for election and all the rest. And I, again, feel that with the selectmen being able to appoint qualified candidates, you will see them apply, and the application states their qualifications and why they want to serve and all the rest. The other thing is that part of the recommendation I sent to you, Mr. Chairman, and hopefully, I don't know where else it went, was that because you now have an elected board, that the amendment, and if it's not in here, I'll offer it on the floor, that as terms expire, then the replacements would be appointed. The point being that we're not trying to wipe out the whole board, but you have 2 terms expiring this year and 1 the following year. So it would be an evolution to an appointed board, and that would, instead of just dropping everyone and trying to appoint 5 members or 8 members at once.
And the information that you sent, that was back in December, that was a few months ago.
That was
correct?
after the meeting that I had with you.
That was sent on to all the committee members.
Yeah, and as I say, the idea that as terms expire, the new members would be appointed would be a qualifier that I would amend at town meeting if it's not in this recommendation.
Okay, very good. Oh, Christie.
Curtis, in this article and then the first article you spoke on,
Yep.
you mentioned about what the rest of the Commonwealth is doing.
Yes.
And that most of the towns. Is there some benefit to why we should align with what the rest of the state is doing?
Well, I think for one thing, it gives you much more local control. It lets, I mean, when we pass zoning by 2/3 majority of town meeting, we decide what's good for the community and within the context of you know, the rules and the state rules and regs. But to have to go to home rule to the legislature to change wording, and you see what happens with home rule legislation. It sits up there, and you've got to petition people, and we chase Tim Madden and ask him to push it and all the rest. I just think that this is local government, and it can be better served if we have a closer touch with what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. Article 90. Article 91. Article 92. Okay, now we get into the real estate section with Article 93. Article 94. Article 95. Article 96. Article 97. Article 98. Article 99. Article 100. Article 101. Article 102. Article 103. Yes, sir. Please step up to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Charles Stott, and I represent the Nantucket Residents Association. And we have been very interested in this 92-acre parcel of land at the head of the plains for some time now. Our interest is in preserving this parcel, or actually as several parcels of land, as open space, and not to have any construction on it at all, if that's at all possible. So I would like to propose on behalf of our organization an amendment to Article 103 that would delete 2 words, and if you're concerned about balance, I would propose adding 2 words. The deletion would be in the 3rd line of Article 103, the 2 words wastewater or would be deleted, and then I would add at the end of that line in perpetuity, so that the beginning of the article will read, to see if the town will vote to authorize the Board of Selectmen to acquire by purchase or gift the fee interest in the following property for open space purposes in perpetuity. And I propose this amendment for two primary reasons. One, I serve on as a member of the Sewer Planning Work Group, which is working on recommendations on updating the comprehensive wastewater management plan, including what we're going to do about wastewater in needs areas such as Nantucket. And while there has been some discussion, not so much lately, but some discussion some time ago about building a wastewater treatment plant on that former FAA site, and estimates range as high as $65 million, it just seems to me that this is economically not a feasible proposition. There are approximately 450 septic systems in Nantucket, and I would venture to guess that 70% of them are used only seasonally. So to spend what comes down to $144,000 per septic system just doesn't seem to make economic sense to me. And of course, there is the environmental aspect of it, and we really value the open space in that area and hope to maintain it. The second reason I propose this amendment is that just a few months ago at special town meeting, the voters approved a rezoning of this 92-acre tract of land from LUG 3 to Morelands Management District, which is, instead of 3-acre zoning, basically 10-acre zoning. Our thinking in supporting this was that if the property were sold to a developer, worst-case scenario would be, 8 or 9 houses on there, and those houses would be limited in footprint to something like 800 square feet of ground cover. So this proposal to include a reference to wastewater seems to me to be in conflict with the letter as well as the spirit of the rezoning that was just approved a few short months ago. Thanks very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any questions, Rolls? And I guess just a point for process is that I have written down your suggestions, and when this committee takes up its motion, this would be part of the motion, so it wouldn't need an amendment on town meeting floor. It would just be our motion. I think it would be a little easier if the committee agrees. Yeah, Christie.
Mr. Stott, does the Nantucket Association have a stance on the wastewater treatment facility, or getting wastewater, town water out to the Nantucket? In other words, does this contradict what maybe might have been voted on at a previous association meeting?
Yeah, well, we've got town water out in Nantucket now. In terms of wastewater treatment, I think an awful lot of the folks out there recognize the value of clean waters in our harbor and the creeks and ponds, and recognize that there's a serious issue with nitrogen loading, in particular phosphorus and other ponds like Hummock Pond. And I think that our folks are beginning to recognize that something has to be done. I'm in the process now of trying to finalize a survey to send out to our 150 or so members to ask them what their thoughts are about wastewater treatments and various alternatives, including piping the effluent out to Surfside, including smaller regional wastewater treatment plants, and outflow into the ocean if the environmental watchdogs would let us get away with that. But right now, most of our folks, pretty much opposed to a treatment plant out there, but I think they're very much open to doing something about what I consider to be a very serious problem.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Cliff?
This might be a question for town council. Earlier in the year, we talked about the CPC money being used to help $600,000.
That's correct, and that is in this.
Right, and I questioned it for open space, so wouldn't that put a covenant on the property?
Mr. Chairman, through you to the previous speaker, the acquisition of property for open space would create protection under what's known as Article 97 of the Massachusetts Constitution, and that essentially means that the land could not be used for any other purpose without a two-thirds vote, not only of town meeting, but also of the state legislature. However, when you appropriate money, CPA money, to acquire open space, you do have to grant a restriction held by a third party, essentially a conservation, a nonprofit conservation organization. This article happens to include language to that effect as well. So whether it's the money's coming from the CPC article or this article, there will be a requirement for a conservation restriction.
Okay. I think I answered your question.
Is it answer? I don't know.
I think so. Well,
I'm still confused. I'm just talking about the wastewater and the sewer, so that it would or wouldn't allow that.
Well, it would ultimately depend upon what the restriction states.
Okay.
Again, you're acquiring it for two different purposes here by vote of town meeting, but the operable document would be the conservation restriction, if it permitted wastewater or not, and that would be something that would have to be negotiated at a later date.
Okay. That makes, now I understand.
all right.
For the third time.
Oh, Tim.
Mr. Chairman, a question to either Andrew or maybe Rick, I'm not sure. And I certainly do appreciate the position the Nantucket residents are taking with their opposition to a plant. But recognizing that our beds are precariously close to the shoreline and the threat of erosion is an issue with the number of beds that we have, I always thought that one of the reasons we were looking at this land was an alternative site should we have to relocate the beds. Am I wrong in my thinking on that, Rick, or is that your recollection? And if we were, I would, Charles, with all due respect, I could support no treatment plant there, but I certainly couldn't support discharge beds going away. I think we need that municipal exemption.
Tim, I don't recall specifically on the beds. I don't think that I recall reading that as part of any plan. I think the reason the town manager and others put this language in was just to create an option, because when it was first drafted, it wasn't as clear that a pipe from Nantucket to the Surfside plant was going to be achievable and economical. So this was an option. But my only sort of comment, not on behalf of the board, but my own reaction is when you say in perpetuity, that brings up other things. This property, there had been discussions about it might be bought in different sections. For example, town money might have Section A. We're talking about dealing also with our local nonprofit entities, the Conservation Foundation, the Land Bank, whether or not they want to buy sections as well. So there are a number of things that aren't totally resolved at this point. I think the town manager said, frankly, to Mr. Stott that she, and I think the board, would probably adopt the same posture, not object to taking out the wastewater purpose. Purposes can always be reconstituted at future town meetings, as council has said, if they become necessary. And that's some response to your question, Tim. But if you put it in perpetuity, then that's another issue. I don't know if that answers you, but...
Well, it does to some degree, but I'm just worried, and again, it wouldn't be for treatment, it would be a place to dump the treated effluent, and that's a huge issue for the community. I mean, I think of this 92-acre parcel as a place that is probably remote,
Yep.
As remote as we can get on Nantucket, and boy, if we needed a place... I
think that's a good comment, Tim. The problem might be getting it back from Surfside to there, but there are a number of issues. But when you have that much space, it can have a value to the community in other ways. So that's one thing I think you're raising.
Okay, thank you. All set? Any other questions?
May I?
Comments? Oh, yes, sir.
Comment? Yeah, in response to Tim's question, I can say that I did check with the town manager and received an email from her saying that the thinking on including those two words, wastewater or, was that if 30, 40, 50 years down the road, because of erosion of the beds at the Surfside plant, that they might consider settling beds in that parcel of land. And that's why it was included. And then she added, however, that, basically that's not a hill that I want to die on. It just seems to me that if the condition of the beds at some point down the road due to erosion in Surfside was an issue, that there are other properties that are already used for, like the landfill and the property that the town owns around it, which might be an alternative for settling beds to the 92 acres out in the west end of the island.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so we'll move on. Article 104. Article 105 concludes the real estate articles. Article 106. Yes, sir. Please come on down. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thanks, Mike Glowacki. Some of you guys might remember that last year at town meeting on this similar article, I had made a proposal to take a chunk of the free cash and put it in the stabilization fund, and that, of course, requires a two-thirds vote of town meeting to put money into or to appropriate money from the stabilization fund. And I went back down to revisit the town clerk's office and get just a refresher on that. You might recall the vote was 99 yes and 50 no, for a total of 149 people voting at that stage of the meeting. And the affirmative action on that would have required 99.33 votes in favor. So we missed out, or I missed out on what I was trying to suggest to the town there, like 0.33 votes. But I was encouraged that the amount of support we had, and I sort of took that to mean there's fairly broad, or at least there was at that time, fairly broad support for doing something like this. And subsequently, I've been hoping that I might hear from some of the town leaders, and as the budget process goes on, some further discussion about the underlying concepts and so forth, and been a little disappointed. Maybe I missed out on that. So I downloaded off the town's website the policies on the financial reserves, and I just jotted some notes all over that in crayon this morning. And my point, I guess now, is just to touch base with all of you on what we were doing back in 2004. A lot of the same people were in different chairs back then. But what we were doing was trying to take some first steps, maybe away from what some people considered to be a little bit of a stopgap or knee-jerk reaction to the uses of free cash and stabilization money, and trying to get a little handle on moving the focus toward long-term planning. And the underlying concept being that if we could get these, my sort of point number 4 on the back page there, if we could get these policies brought along maybe a little bit further and updated, revised, or whatnot, that it seems to me that the use of the stabilization fund could really enhance long-term planning, unlike any other short-term or like any 1 year's issue. Something that takes a two-thirds vote at town meeting to get at the funds, just by definition, would mean we were using the money for broad community goals. And as the fund balance grew, people would start planning in advance about how they might get their hands on the money. And I think it would really promote that, and I think it would keep town meeting more relevant, because as the town grows and things become more and more specialized and more committees, the work gets done. And you hear a lot of people saying, I was at town meeting, but do you really know what's going on? And so if we could do something with these, further these policies and grow a sizable fund there, I am suggesting that could be healthy for a couple of reasons. And so I don't really suggest that it's something we're going to hash out here this afternoon, but I would just point out a couple of things about these policies. The free cash where it says on here, previously adopted August 3rd, 2005, that was brought forward at the same time the stabilization policy was brought forward. That was adopted immediately in January of that year, and then we were working with the Finance Committee and in terms of trying to get consensus about what these policies ought to be. And it took a little while to get that. And the gist of it was, in the second paragraph of the free cash, was to keep a significant amount of money in unappropriated fund balance to kind of help with cash flow. And that was especially important then because the stabilization fund, which can serve to that same point, was pretty much depleted. And so as we then flipped the page and got going on the stabilization, we fairly quickly got to our initial goals, and fairly painlessly. It wasn't like we really went without other things that the town needed. And so we have that sum of money there. There's a whole paragraph under stabilization that probably could be highlighted out and labeled use of stabilization for the operating, supporting the operating budget, because that's the part that gets into the, if we use it, then we don't use it again before we put the money back. And that was really sort of at that time in support of the operating budget. Not necessarily to be the same thing if you're going to use a chunk of money toward the new school or the sewer plant or any number of other worthwhile things we have to do. And a couple of things that I thought were interesting, in the first paragraph of the policy, it talks about, under the state law, communities may establish funds, one or more stabilization funds, for different purposes and may appropriate into them in any year an amount not to exceed 10% of the prior year's tax levy. So in any one year, that would be the maximum the state law allows us is quite a few $1 million. Then it goes on to say, the total of all stabilization funds shall not exceed 10% of the community's equalized value. Community's equalized value being something like $17 billion, the last number I saw. So we wouldn't be in trouble with the state regulators until we had $1.7 billion in our fund. And I think that's interesting context. So then it goes on in the second paragraph till we set the initial targets. And what I'm sort of hopeful for, and I guess I'm here to volunteer for, if any of you all or any of the other town leaders, Mr. Atherton, if you guys want to get on board this year and get us over the .33 vote, that we might have a little bit of conversation about this before town meeting, where I'll be doing my usual shtick in the absence of any other thing. So those are the limits of state law about being responsible. We got to our initial target quickly and painlessly. We haven't done much after those first 3 years. We just sort of 3 or 4 years, we've just sort of gone along. And what I'm really here to say is that it's time to look at the policy and see what it ought to be. And I don't purport to have the single answer, but I just think it's, in the absence of doing anything, then I'll just be advocating that we put a chunk into the deep lock cookie jar. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Cliff, and then Christie.
Michael, I think this goes with the recent request from the Capital Program Committee to give the long-term capital views. And I think the town of Arlington did a one-time override to the taxpayers and opened a stabilization fund, and they're doing the same thing where they've predicted out so many years. And I think the concerns everybody had about the stabilization fund where you wanted to put the money in was that it was already funded, or the one we had was already funded, and it was set up for stabilization, not for a long-term capital project.
Exactly, and so that's
Right.
what I'm saying, it's time to kind of look at all that.
Absolutely.
Because I know that when we did this initially, the idea was how much can you bite off at one time, and it was with the full intent of learning from that and then going wherever it seemed appropriate after that. One of the big, I think, one of the things that's talked about a lot in the issues with the Capital Program Committee, every year we get around budgeting time and we hear about we want to get into long-term planning. And of course, the makeup of the Capital Program Committee, like every other committee, evolves over time. And any long-term plan is only as good as it is until the next vote comes along. And so a lot of times, I think the history of the effectiveness of long-term planning through the Capital Program Committee kind of says that we could do with a little figuring out how to enhance that process. And that's the spirit that I offer this all in.
Christie?
Michael, there's some years we have a healthy return in free cash, and some years we do not. So I'm wondering, is there are you envisioning like a trigger amount to trigger this? Because when we don't have a healthy return, then those funds can be pretty valuable as well.
Well,
So-
yes, and so I mean, everybody could maybe have your own definition of where a trigger might be. I don't propose to have the golden rule answer. I know that initially it was, let's be very conservative, because the debate at the time was that having a policy in place inherently limits the flexibility, which is, of course, the whole point of having the policy. And so we're feeling our way with that. And if you're in a situation where the free cash and the Finance Committee reserves and the various reserve funds are actually making up the amount of the budget that's discretionary after your contractual increases and things you have to do, and that's all done by a very few people, that's the part that sort of concerns me, that is making town meeting becomes less relevant and things get more and more. Well, I think my point's made on that. So yeah, I mean, how much do you need of the free cash? Now that you've got something in the stabilization, you've sort of accomplished the need to make cash flow a little bit easier. You've got a little, if the receipts aren't quite there, you have some cash on hand, and so that was one of the initial ideas of leaving free cash unappropriated. And so now you're in a place where you can start to appropriate, and rather than go with the what's been called the grab bag effect toward the end, after all the hearings are all done, and in the last sort of couple of weeks up to town meeting, those in the know about what can I sort of take a grab at free cash, or my new tires, or my new shelves, or my new roof on this building, or whatever it is, and sort of make an end run around the whole planning process. Better to sort of lock that money up if whatever the proposal is merit, has enough merit that we ought to be spending money on it, then we ought to spend money on it, whether we have leftover funds or not, and get to a long-term clearly out in the open on the leftover funds.
Okay.
It's really about, if you guys want to work on it at all, I'm happy to do that. And,
Well, thank you for your offer. John?
As you indicated, there's a couple, when you look at policy, there's a couple of policies that are, in my view, fairly onerous about the present stabilization fund. Makes it useless. We got money sitting there, and it makes it very hard to use it because you got to replace it next year anyway.
in support of the operating fund.
Yep.
Right. But if you're to use it for some other purpose, I don't think that applies when you look at the policy.
Well, I was going to ask you, but this doesn't say that. This just says that you want to, so the question is, how would you go about assuring, if I'm going to vote for it, I would say to you, I'm okay with this, but not with a couple of the provisions of the policy, not of the statute itself, but the policies that surround it, which can be changed.
Yeah.
But how do I know it's going to be changed?
So these are policies adopted by the Board of Selectmen.
I understand. How do I know it's going to be changed, though, if we
That's what I'm suggesting, is if there's some work on this, and if some consensus bubbles up, and we look to the selectmen about, what can we do about this, and get some reaction, then we have the benefit of sort of knowing that. As you read it now, when you read the stabilization policy, the final paragraph, what it says is, and I think it's just a matter of formatting, because it could be labeled operating budget. It says the stabilization fund may only be used to support the operating budget when revenue increases less than 3% from the prior year, et cetera. Then it goes on to say the amount withdrawn from the fund shall be equal the amount necessary to bring the year-over-year increase within a certain range, whichever is less. There will not be any additional withdrawals until the amount withdrawn is replenished, all that what you're talking about, but that's all underneath and all in furtherance of the use of the funds to support the operating budget. And it's not about the use of the funds for any purpose at all. And I just know, I just offer you from personal recollection when we're putting this together that was thinking that went in there, whether it's clear or whether the lawyers want to take it apart and say it needs to be written differently, no doubt. Is that enough for now, Mr. Chairman?
It's all very helpful. Thank you.
See you all soon.
Thank you for the information.
Go on, Rick. You're on board.
Oh, jeez.
We'll have you go to a board meeting and have the discussion.
We'll be following up. Okay. Any other comments on 106? Article 107. Okay, that covers the entire warrant. Before we close the public hearing, are there any other comments on any articles? Okay. And at this point, I would like to close the public hearing. Thank you for all for attending. We will continue on with our agenda as Finance Committee, and the next item is a review/discussion regarding Amendment 5 to the waste service agreement with the landfill operation, which is Waste Options. And this is on our agenda, actually at behest of the Board of Selectmen. There is a potential agreement that, or there is I'll say a potential agreement that the board has not ratified yet, and they have asked for our input into this agreement. So you did receive information and a few emails and a bit of data to look over. And I would like to introduce George Aronson to give an overview of this amendment. And thank you, sir, for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, to the Finance Committee. George Aronson. Just very briefly, I was asked to stand in. I know that Town Manager Gifson is unfortunately unable to be here because of illness. The Fifth Amendment to the Waste Services Agreement, which is in your packet along with some supplementary materials, would change the way in which tip fees are charged for C&D, commercial C&D waste that is delivered to the transfer station at the landfill, and in which payments are made between the town and Waste Options. Just by way of background, C&D waste from commercial sources has, to this point, or in recent years, has been handled under Amendment 4 to the Waste Services Agreement, which was back in 2002, and some of you may be familiar with that amendment. But under that which is now the existing arrangement, the town set the tip fee, which is currently at $372 per ton for commercial C&D waste, and then there was a set of fees, a fixed fee, and then a per ton fee for the handling and management of the C&D waste, which since, I believe, 2006, is now being sent off island to processing facilities on the mainland. And there's a handling fee and then a cost for sending it off island, which is what is called a direct cost, a reimbursement, pass-through cost on the agreement. Since that time, there's been a major change in the nature of the commercial C&D waste handling on the island. There is now coming into commercial operation a second transfer station that has the capability to accept commercial C&D waste. So what was at one time the only way on the island to get rid of this material, and so was not a competitive business, is now a competitive business. And in light of that change, which basically changes the structure of how things are handled on the island, again, if you go back to 2002, the tip fee was set up and the fees were set up with the idea that revenue would be generated through this particular arrangement that would cross-subsidize some of the other activities that are occurring at the landfill underneath the auspices of the Waste Services Agreement. But it was an inflexible arrangement because the idea was there's only one place to go, and the tip fee could be set at an amount that would have to be paid. Now that we're going into an environment where the business will be competitive. That's no longer the case. There will be competition, so if the situation remains where the tip fee is set and cannot change, and the competitor can reduce the tip fee at will, then it's obviously a situation where the town's operation is at a competitive disadvantage to the other operation. The other problem being that it having been set up with cross-subsidies, the subsidies would go away, and there would be a need for funds to make up the difference. So that's the background for the situation that got us to the need for the Fifth Amendment. I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion of the history of how we got from there to here. Let's just say that there was a lot of discussion over a fairly significant period of time to get to this point. Waste Options had its views, the town had its views. This was not an amendment that was easily reached in negotiations. I think it's fair to say that there were sustained negotiations back and forth, and dare I say, even some pain to get here. But I think what we've come to is an amendment that has a number of advantages to the town. And the first is that it gets the town out of responsibilities of setting a price in a business that is now competitive. That would now become Waste Options' responsibility for setting the tip fees, for acquiring or competing with the other commercial entity for C&D waste from commercial sources. It stabilizes town funding and subsidies for services that frankly aren't provided by any other business. The town does things at the Nantucket site no one else does and working with Waste Options that frankly aren't done elsewhere or through any other mechanism on Nantucket. It's important to stabilize that situation so that the work that needs to be done gets done. For example, the town takes C&D waste from residents, from nonprofits at no cost, from town departments, from beach cleanups, takes waste that were not accepted under those arrangements, might be dumped in the moors or not disposed of properly, and the town basically steps up to do that to prevent the dumping and other impacts that might occur, and that has a cost that the town has to cover. The town, and that goes also for managing waste from town activities, street sweepings, beach cleanups, et cetera. The materials recovery facility for recycling has always been underfunded, and if you look at the waste services agreement, the fees paid there do not cover, or the fees that the town pays to Waste Options do not cover Waste Options costs in operating that facility. That goes also for certain activities at the landfill that have to be undertaken. And I'm not going to go through all those activities because I missed the 8 o'clock plane, but I think that if we went through, and I think I've done this before with the selectmen and other groups involved in this process, there's been a lot of discussion about taking steps to unbundle the cross-subsidies and start getting to the points where the costs are starting to match better the activities. It's not something that will happen overnight, but every step we take in that direction is an improvement. And I think the amendment does that as well. And finally, there are items like electronics, items with freon coils, and what we call difficult-to-manage waste, where the town site is the site of last resort. No one else wants to deal with it. The town is dealing with it. Without the Fifth Amendment, if the tip fee can't be dropped, then the C&D waste is going to go somewhere else, and those cross-subsidies and revenue that would be there will no longer be there, and there will be a problem finding that revenue and making sure the services are provided. The alternative is for the town to just decide unilaterally to drop the tip fee and basically eat the lost revenue itself without changing the arrangement with Waste Options. So what the Fifth Amendment does is it's a bridge between the two options. It allows Waste Options the ability to compete. It sets the incentives so that to the extent that Waste Options is successful in obtaining more waste at slightly higher tip fees, both Waste Options benefits and the town benefits from the additional revenue. So the incentives are for the town and Waste Options to both benefit by working together. We went back and forth on how to share the gains and losses, and this is where we ended up. I think it's a reasonable cost. Staff's recommendation to the town administration was to go forward with the amendment, which is why it's before the selectmen. Obviously, there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of complexity. So we're happy to shed light on whatever aspects of the agreement or the amendment would be helpful to the Finance Committee with that background.
Thank you very much. Ready to take some questions? Members, any questions from any committee members? John?
George, I think you're on the right track, and I don't have any fear. There's no way I can assimilate this and understand. So my question to you is, the thing I always look for in a contract or a deal is, I agree with you 100%. Any deal like that, having cross-references like that is terrible. You might as well just, that's a definition of a bad deal. The point is there anything, have you really looked at this amendment from a point of view, is there anything in there that's apt to have the same type of result in the long run should something different happen?
And my answer is a yes. And I think, in fact, we were looking precisely at that with respect to the C&D waste, and the answer is to get the town out of setting the tip fee. And I think that's the big, let waste options handle the commercial side of the business. What we've done is, the way it's set up, there's a fixed portion and a variable portion, so the town's ultimate exposure is capped. So in the worst event, if waste option goes out and does a bad job of bringing in waste, the town knows what the number is. The waste options does a good job of bringing in waste, well, then we're only better than that cap. So that, in that sense, by having a worst case and knowing what that worst case is, we've addressed one issue, which is, over all the scenarios, is there something you're not thinking about that might happen that gets you worse off? So I think that's one part. There are a couple of technical crossovers. I think you may see in there an item about net recyclables credit, which I think in the original agreement was something that had a very long lag time to get reconciled, and we've shortened that time, and I think that's also a benefit. I think when we went through the agreement with waste options, there were other issues that inevitably came up that, had we waited there, it might have taken a lot more time to sort through those issues and settle them. And I think we said, you know what, we're not going to settle all of the issues in the time we have, and time is ticking because the other facility is now completed. They're starting to accept waste. Given the course of negotiations, I guess our judgment was we can't fix everything at this point, but everything that we've changed is an improvement that goes in the right direction. And we have caps in there so that nothing really backfires in terms of an unanticipated reaction, which I think is what you're looking for in terms of your question.
Not perfect.
Well, we don't live in a perfect world, but improvements, and I think we're comfortable with the improvements.
Greg?
And I guess to follow up on what John said, when Kara from DPW was here, she said, I guess the figure of 20% reduction going to this new outfit. Are you comfortable with that number? Because to me it seems that there's an example where, what if it's 50%?
And I guess the answer is, if it's 50%, well, we know what the cap is. So we know where we are if we're wrong. And we went through this. I think we actually, in a number of sessions, have done a lot of homework in terms of pulling out the haulers. There are not that many waste haulers on the island of Nantucket. We tend to know who they are. We tend to have some insights into their individual operations, what they're likely to do, where the construction activity is. Is it on the west side of the island, the east side of the island? If it's on the west side of the island, there's still an advantage from a transportation point of view from going to the Nantucket site. There are certain types of customers that, again, the town is the site of last resort, where a commercial business might not want to handle certain types of small accounts where they may come to waste options, especially if the other things are equal. So, yeah, we went through the question of what are the numbers. So the numbers we're looking at, the answer is we don't know for sure, but we know what the outcomes is over the range of scenarios, and that's where we are.
Christie.
George, you had made a comment just a bit ago. You said if waste options doesn't do a great job getting those tip fees in, then we'll know about it. And then you had mentioned that if they do a good job, we're in better shape.
Yeah.
So will we know about it if they're doing better? And I guess my question is, how do you feel with this new amendment about the transparency of information back and forth?
Actually, I feel good about it. I think, first of all, the town is still running the scale house, so when a truck goes over the scale, the town has the information it needs. I think there's some provisions in there for a little bit more transparency. We've already, the town has some tracking spreadsheets that we've used, and we've already updated them to account of the new information, and we've seen some recent improvements in the information going back and forth. So I'm comfortable that, in fact, signing and going forward with the amendment will lead to an improvement, and we're already seeing some of those improvements.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead.
What is the responding entity for that transparency on the town side?
Well,
Is it DPW? Would it be you? Would it be town administration, board of selectmen?
the answer is yes.
Okay.
When a truck goes over the scale, that information is handled at DPW. It's reported to DPW administration. I get a monthly report from DPW administration we've been working through, so we know what's going on. Town administration is also involved, and so that we've been working together now for a while, and the system seems to have come a long way from when we started to change the systems in 2008. I think that things like, for example, every time an invoice comes in from Waste Options, we have the backup. We do our own simulation of the invoice. We check everything. We go back and forth. We can turn it around. The town still has the ultimate power of, if it doesn't have what it wants, well, it needs more time to look at the invoice until it gets what it wants. And so I think by having the town in the driver's seat in terms of collecting the revenues and having invoice approval, that's a piece of leverage that, if it's needed, has a lot of power to the commercial entity that wants to get paid. Frankly, recently that's been a fairly smooth process, and so that that gives us more confidence as we go forward. We can build on that recent experience.
All right, thank you.
Cliff?
I'm trying to wrap my head around the figures when we say that there's a loss, and there's a lot of things come to mind. Do we ever guarantee them a certain amount of revenue or a certain amount of tonnage? Because as we look at the numbers of the tonnage from, say, 2010, they were at 6,000. They've grown to 7,800. So we're up like, I'd say, 30%. And with the amount of permits that are now being issued, it almost seems like there's going to be plenty of C&D for everybody to go around. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, the way this works is there are two payments in this particular piece of the contract. There's a fixed payment, which is essentially equivalent to the handling fee over 3,000 tons. So we went back and forth, and one of the things that became evident was that it would be easier to put in place the type of arrangement that would have the right incentives for both parties to gain if there was essentially, I'll use the word deductible on the first 3,000 tons. If the town would say, okay, we're going to pay this amount, but then above that amount, our fee goes way down below what it would have been, then Waste Options and its investors and lenders have some certainty as to a minimum amount of money they will get out of the arrangement. The town is capping its losses at a fixed number, and then as you go above that, both parties benefit from the increased tip fee. So the answer is yes, there is that 0 to 3,000 ton regime where, yeah, if you go from 2,999 to 3,000 tons, it's about the same. But above that, the town benefits, and that was the way. The town had to give up a little something in order to get those incentives correct above that range. And again, our view is that we're likely to be above that minimum, so that it won't kick in, and hopefully all parties will benefit from that.
That almost wasn't really my question.
Okay.
But you almost answered my second question. Maybe it was ESPN there. To get back to that, the fixed amount, the $571,440, we also pay that fixed fee, but we also, for the first 3,000, we're also going to pay the variable rate on top of it, or not? You're saying just the fixed fee for the first 3,000?
No, they are additive. Okay.
Okay. Huh.
But the variable fee is much lower than the old variable fee was.
Because in the formula, they just use $300 as A, and if we use our tipping fee that we use now, the A is $372, so C would be 0. I just started doing a lot of math. It's kind of a double-edged sword to see what would happen if Waste Options, seeing they have the ability to change the tipping fee up or down, what it really meant to us.
Yeah.
So if we use the tipping fee of $372, you're going to take $372 from $372. You're going to get 0. You're going to divide it by 2. You're still going to get 0. So you're going to get 95, which is going to be F,
Right.
which you're going to add to 130.
Right.
So under the line items, I was trying to figure out if 130, I thought, represented the amount we give to the haulers to take it off island. But on the line item for our budget, we put that separately. We put that at $1.1 million. So it seems like we're giving somebody the hauler fee twice.
Okay, let's deconstruct that. Okay, the 130 is actually a pass-through cost, so that Waste Options pays the haulers to take it off island, and the town reimburses Waste Options for what Waste Options payments were. Okay.
So so it says Waste Options pay after the formula is 180. Say under the 300, it's 189. It would be more if obviously the answer was
Right.
0. But then I'm just trying to make sure that we're not doing it twice. It seemed like the 130 was thrown in there on top of it. So it seemed like the pay for Waste Options was 139, but you're trying to tell me that they didn't extract the 130 back out and give it to the hauler?
Yes. And in fact, it's just a pass-through cost.
Huh.
So that, and in fact, part of the invoice review process is to make sure the backup for the 130 is there, so we know how many tons we're paying the 130 on. And I think we've been going through this for a while. But, yeah, in fact, to rewind a little bit, the original example did not have the 130 in it, and then to make the numbers more realistic, we included the 130 as a payment to Waste Options, but also it is also an expense to Waste Options. So Waste Options is neutral with respect to that particular number. It's a reimbursement of cost that they experience. And yes, in the town budget, the hauling costs off islands are actually a different line item than the other fees that are paid to Waste Options. So that one is essentially, I think, freight, and the other is on the professional services budget.
Now, you didn't want to go way back, but on page 5, I call them like a coefficient. We use the 372, and we use the 95, and they never changed. And I was wondering what those numbers for the formula represented.
Okay.
I apologize.
The 372 is the tip fee that the town has been charging for the last at least 5 years for commercial C&D. That's the tip fee that, in theory, the town would continue to charge if there were no competition. Okay, that's the tip fee that would be the basis for collecting enough revenue to cross-subsidize some of the other activities. So it's not a number that's ever been subject to an escalator. It was a number that the town picked based on factors from a number of years ago to get the cross payments correct. And similarly, the 95 is a number that was picked in negotiations back and forward with Waste Options. It's not a number that's intended to escalate. It's just a basis for cost sharing going forward.
Okay. Can I continue?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was trying to wrap my head around the difference between, first I just thought there was a fee for the building that started out years ago at $25,000 a month, and then it escalated also. And I know at the selectmen's meeting the other night, they were asking, and maybe you have the answer, about the fact that the building hasn't been there, or we haven't used it because it burned down. So then they came up with the philosophy that the fee for the building really was also not just for like a mortgage on the building, but it was part of the handling of the thing. But then I came down and I saw that there was also a fee for so much tonnage that goes into the building. So it just seemed like, again, we were being charged twice for the building's
Okay,
use.
let me separate the two fixed fees, because this is certainly confusing, and certainly, the first time you look at it, it's a bit of work to untangle. The Fifth Amendment would not in any way change this fixed amount, which corresponds to what's called the C&D fixed facility fee or such, which is the $25,000 a month, half of which has been escalated since it was instituted in 2002. Okay. And again, though it was named the C&D fixed facility fee in 2002, it was part of a whole package from 2002 that was meant to balance a number of cash flows, and there are a number of different purposes. So if you look at the memos from 2001 and 2 as to why that fee was in there, you'll see all sorts of things referenced other than the building itself. And I don't think it's fair to say that that amount was set aside for the building. I think it's fair to say that was one of the payments among a set of payments, all of which taken together met a certain set of expenses. And the simple correspondence isn't quite so simple. That would not change. And in fact, when we looked at and taken our own look at costs and at waste options reasonably, it turns out that that number, which is fixed and escalates with 50% of CPI, is about the same as the difference between what the MRF actually costs waste options and what waste options is getting paid for recycling. In fact, one of my suggestions was to say, here's this amount, which in fact is going into the mix, which is in fact what it's doing is it's reimbursing waste options for what it's spending on running the recycling facility. Maybe we ought to label that more correctly. Well, it turns out it's a little more complicated than that, but my recommendation is whatever waste options costs it, that ought to be in the town's recycling budget, because that would make the numbers look better and more accurate. But that being what it is, that number is separate from the question of what is the town paying per ton for commercial C&D. And we've gone from a system under the existing contract where the town is paying $190 and change per ton for every ton that goes in, plus $130 and change for every ton that gets transported to the mainland, making a total of $320, which was the old system. The new system is the town pays a fixed fee of $571,000 a year, but then what they're paying per ton is a lot less than $190. It's $95 and go through the formula, whatever it is, depending on the tip fee. $95 adjusted for reduction in tip fee from the $372, so it might be $60 or $55 or in that range. So now you're paying a fixed amount up front, and then you're paying, say, $55 or $60 a ton, instead of paying the $190 per ton. And then the question is, how soon do you make up what the fixed portion? Well, somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 tons. You're crossing over and doing better.
Yeah, I think that would have been better represented if we just left the 130 out of there and just kept it on a line item and not, you know what I mean?
I hear you. I appreciate the suggestion.
Anyway, all right.
All set?
I don't know. I'm thinking.
Oh, sorry.
I do appreciate the...
I know. Well, it's the first time we've ever talked about the landfill that I know of in 4 years, so I got a lot, I had a lot of questions. Yeah, I'm trying. All right. Well, go ahead. I'll think of something. Maybe I'll come back.
That's fine. Are there any other questions from the committee? Or any questions from the audience?
Oh, I got another question.
Back to you, sir.
Then we also have designated fees. When we have C&D, you talked about it, the fees for like the regular...
the residential.
Residential, we just
Yeah.
throw it in the dumpster. How does that, wouldn't that be better served if we, now they're going to decide what the tipping fee is, and people who just throw, it's not necessarily a tipping fee, I call that just, regular homeowner's trash, even though it's considered C&D.
Right now,
In your opinion, that would be, subject to this change in the
on the
fee?
contrary, there's no change at all in the treatment of that particular.
Oh, I thought there was. I thought that includes in the tipping fee they're going to set.
No. That right now, the selectmen made the decision to accept that waste at no cost, in part to keep it from being disposed in other ways at no cost, namely.
Oh, I just thought we had to pay them the tipping fee that they set at that rate.
The town pays waste option handling fee per ton of that material, and that arrangement has not changed and would not change under the Fifth Amendment. So the changes solely address the...
Then which would be
commercial.
how much a ton then?
It's the 190, plus whatever it costs to get it off the island, which
Okay.
is now 130.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Very good. Okay.
Other questions?
Well, what I'd like to do with this item, or any other questions, is continue this till Thursday and have it on the agenda and just discuss this again, because the idea is that the board has asked us to weigh in on this, and so we'll compile a list of what we think and be presented to the board so they can take action on February 19th to go forward or not with it.
And I'm happy to answer other questions that you may think of between now and then, and feel free to email
Okay.
me or call me, whatever.
I'll go ahead and do that. So if anybody has any other questions, send them to me, and I'll certainly get them to you, George. All right, thank you very much.
Why I'm here.
Oh, Tim.
Well, I don't have a question, but just kind of a mechanical question.
Sure. Yeah.
If we're going to talk about this on Thursday, then the one thing I think we should maybe talk about as a committee, is there anything we need from town council? Because I suspect if we want to talk about this on Thursday, we won't have the luxury of the same talent in the room that we do today.
That's true.
And so, much like we do on the warrant, when we talk about draft motions or ideas for thoughts, I think we ought to spend just a little bit more time talking about it just while we have council here, because I think to talk about this on Thursday, in the absence, we may get bogged down with questions and have no answers.
So shoot away. That's what, there's no time limit. We can feel free to discuss. Are there any questions for town council?
I guess I'll get back to my original question. Was there I just think that the rate at which C&D is growing, I was just looking to see if we seem to feel, maybe this is just my opinion, we have an obligation to make sure Waste Options makes a certain amount of money, or makes money, or it isn't cheated out of C&D. Was there a thing in the contract that said we had to give so much C&D to them, or they were supposed to make so much money on C&D? I thought originally the C&D was more of just part of the contract, and until they started, after 10 years of the contract and houses started being knocked down and it became a lucrative business, I just didn't think it was part of the equation. Somehow it's become part of the equation. I didn't know if we had a real obligation to them to make, if you understand my question.
Well, with respect to municipal solid waste, excluding the C&D, based on the original contract, there is what's called a guaranteed minimum tonnage, and that was not, the C&D waste was not part of that. And it was strictly, pay as you go, if you will. This Fifth Amendment does change that formula. As George explained, there is this minimum payment now of $571,000. So that will be a new fixed fee in addition to the minimum tonnage requirements for MSW. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, so I'm trying to say, in the past, we didn't really have any legal obligation. There was no fixed amount of tonnage promised or any contingency that...
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Correct.
Further questions, town council? Tim?
Were there any, John, to you?
Yes, sir.
Were there any kind of supporting documents that you provided to the selectmen to help them make a decision that you could provide to the finance committee? Was there a legal opinion that we could look at as a committee to help us?
I've been involved, Tim, in these negotiations since the beginning, and we really approached this as a team approach. It was, of course, George, the town manager, the DPW director, and I provided the legal support. I think George has been pretty much the author of the documentation, but everything has been thoroughly reviewed, not only by the town administration, but by me as well. And so I'm comfortable. I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a numbers person, but I sat down and I went through all the scenarios and did my own calculations just to verify that what was written on paper, it was in fact the intent of the parties. and I'm satisfied that we have achieved a Fifth Amendment that does, in fact, achieve the desired result, at least from our perspective, that there be a sharing of any, that there be a real incentive here for waste options to maximize the amount of C&D waste that's captured. Obviously, there are some basic assumptions that we're making in terms of diversion rates, et cetera, and that's a business term and a business calculation. But from a legal perspective, I think, in my opinion, the amendment accurately reflects the business decision that we're making here.
I have one question, I suppose. Are you done?
Well, just...
Go ahead, then I'll answer.
Just a follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
So what you're really saying is the team recommendation to the board was to support.
Was what, I'm sorry?
So your recommendation, along with George...
Yes.
Your recommendation to the Board of Selectmen was to support the amendment?
Yes, correct.
My question is, I guess, is for either, is that if this were to get a negative vote by the board, where does it back to square one with this?
Well,
That's a check.
John, either one, I guess I'll throw it at...
I don't want to say too much because we're in open session,
okay.
Mr. Chairman, but there certainly has been a concern expressed by the operator and indirectly by the bondholders or the note holders that they went to finance this facility. And I think that it's fair to say that there was, ever since the other facility was permitted, there's been a great deal of concern by the operator that unless something was done to incentivize, if you will, the efforts to retain as much of the C&D waste as possible, which is essentially, in a competitive market, reducing that 372 to some level,
right.
That if we weren't able to achieve that, there would most likely have been serious pressure on waste options to be able to continue to pay their bondholders, which in my estimation would have resulted in, I don't think it's unreasonable that we could have expected litigation,
okay,
as there has been in the past with this facility.
I didn't mean to be delicate on that. I
But
get the idea.
but we're talking about the financial viability not only of the operation but of waste options. So I think it's fair to say that the team, when we recommended this to the selectmen, felt that if we could avoid that and certainly the uncertainties associated with a contract dispute of this magnitude, that it was best to work hard to try to come up with a solution that everybody is comfortable with. And I think we achieved that.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And I might also add that there are further opportunities. It's not like we signed this Fifth Amendment and we're done. There are further opportunities and discussions planned to see if there's ways to make this a more viable operation for both the operator and the town. And so we very well may come back with a Sixth Amendment at some point. I don't want to get into too much detail on that, but it's a continuing process that we're looking at to try to achieve a better result for the town.
Thank you. Christie?
I don't know, I guess this could be for either of you, but I'm just wondering, because we really have no idea what the diversion is going to be. And so I'm wondering, what is the flexibility of this amendment as far as annually, every 5 years? Is there some sort of something you can say to that?
No,
to give us some comfort, because anyway.
There really isn't, but you have to bear in mind that this agreement is coming to the end of its term. I think it's in 2024. Mm-hmm. So whatever happens at that point, the town's going to have to make a significant decision. Do you want to continue with a private operation? Do you want to take it over yourself? Would there be an opportunity at that point to really look at a different model? And the answer to that is yes. So there is a relatively, I know 9 years maybe, or 10 years, doesn't seem like, seems like a long time, but with this kind of a contract, it really isn't. So, and that's one of the pressures for looking at potentially a Sixth Amendment, to see if there isn't some way to incentivize both the town and waste options to look at a more long-term solution.
Christie?
Is the idea that that Sixth Amendment would come at the time of the expiring contract?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It could come sooner,
Okay.
depending upon whether or not we could reach some agreement on, refinancing opportunities for waste options, that kind of thing, so that we can achieve benefits much sooner than the end of the term.
It's in their both interests?
Yes.
Okay.
Always. Cliff?
I know there's an escalator, from what I've been told, is as a result of, when you sign a long-term contract for 25 years. Seeing we're redoing the contract and it's got 10 years, and I don't want to get into executive session, but wouldn't we think about eliminating the escalator, seeing we're doing this contract and we kind of, it's no longer long-term?
I'll just say that, in fact, the escalator was one of the issues that was discussed in the course of the negotiations. So, that issue did get some attention, yes.
All right. I just get back to council. I'm just wondering what the philosophy is from Waste Options, because as I see that the tonnage go from 6,000 in 2010 to almost 8,000 last year, even if the predicted amount is 25%, I don't see where the bondholders. It almost seems like we should, I don't want to say wait, but see how things work out. I mean, we're already, even if we went back to 6,000, we're at levels that I guess we existed and we paid the bills at. So, I mean, I'm just wondering why they feel it's such a threat to the other C&D facility.
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for Waste Options, who's here.
Oh, please.
You want to
Oh, please, go. Either one, sir. No, either one. Make yourself comfortable. If you just don't mind introducing.
Of course.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
I'm Jeff Blees with the law firm of Foley & Lardner. I represent Waste Options, and certainly available to ask or answer any of the questions you have that you'd like to direct to us. But
Okay, thank you.
I think George has done a terrific job of trying to summarize a very complex agreement, very complex set of financial data that you're looking at. And certainly John has talked to some of the issues. But what I'd like to remind the committee is this is a very narrow amendment, and it's a stopgap measure to deal with this new threat, really, to the diversion of revenue away from the facility. And, the fact is, whether we agree with the cross-subsidization approach, that's what we have in the current situation. So these C&D revenues are not tied simply to supporting the C&D operation. Pardon me. It also supports other operations out of the landfill. And if you look at where we started back in 1996 with the closure order from DEP to where we are today with, I think, the leading solid waste and recycling facility in the country, and something to be very, very proud of. There have been a number of changes that have had to be made over the years, and the change we're looking at here is really very narrow. And the question is, we're your partners. This is a public-private partnership, and your partner has a published price for a C&D tipping fee that you're charging to your customers. And now we have a competitor. And I don't think it's very difficult to see that without the ability to react to that competition and adjust that price, there's a very real and very imminent threat to the revenue being realized from the C&D that supports the rest of the operation. So, how long do we have? Do we take a wait and see? We're trying to avoid getting back into an arbitration or litigation on the subject. We can't afford to wait. We need the ability to compete. And frankly, I think from our perspective, that's all this Fifth Amendment does. With respect to the other issues, we have a lot of ideas for ways we can save money out at this site. And those are things that we began to talk about with town council and your consultant, and we realized this is going to take a lot longer to work these issues out than this Fifth Amendment. We need to really focus on the C&D and the ability for your partner to compete in the marketplace for the C&D revenue and deal with these other issues in a separate negotiations, which we're happy to do. I mean, we're as anxious to sit down and talk about those issues as John and George know, as you are. So, it's not like we're trying to avoid those issues, but we know that it took us months to work out this agreement. It will take us probably months to work out an acceptable arrangement for the next one. So, but I'm happy to answer questions from our perspective.
Thank you. Any questions? John?
I've got more of a statement to make. You know, you don't wait until you've lost the business to do something about it. You just don't, period. I don't know any other way to put it. As a businessman, you do not wait until you lose the business and then do something about it. You do something about it before you lose it, and that's what they're talking about now. The only issue we're trying to get at is and I'm trying to find out from this is to find out is what we're trying to achieve in the Fifth Amendment. And it sounds to me like it's, you hear from our attorney, you hear from George, and it sounds to me like that's, without being an expert on it, it sounds like they've got about as close as they're going to get for a while. And the last thing we need to do is delay, in my view.
Thank you. Further, Tim. Yeah.
John, if that's a motion, I'll second it. Could have said it better myself.
Well, I suppose we could take motions. That'd be fine with me. Further questions or comments from the committee? Mr. Cliff.
Just trying to wrap my head, 'cause like you said, we haven't talked about this, and I think it's great. When you say you use the C&D to pay for not just the C&D, but all the rest of the, I know you don't want to go back there, but anyway, the rest of the part of the facility, the original contract was basically for the recyclables, and from what I gather is the C&D was just kind of a, part of the program, and it wasn't such a big burden as it is now, and now it's become a moneymaker. So I guess that's the premise I'm trying to wrap my head around, that all of a sudden we look at the C&D as part of the existing contract, where I believe it didn't used to be.
Well, it was always included, but there was a change in law.
Right.
And, whenever you're dealing with environmental regulation, there's one thing you can be sure of, it'll change, which is why, George is so valuable to the town as a consultant. So there was a change in law. There was an amendment back at that time, and we've been dealing with that under that amendment since. The new change here is that there's now obviously a new operator with the ability, with a standalone C&D facility, to divert the C&D from our facility to that facility. So we have to anticipate that loss of revenue. Whatever it is, we can, I think, probably discuss that for a long time, and we'll know in a couple of years. But the prudent thing is to get out in front of that, allow us to set that price and compete for the town. We have shared savings in this agreement. We have potential for shared revenue if we're successful. So the incentives are aligned as partners. So that's really all we're asking for.
Further questions or comments? Okay. Well, very good. Well, again, this will be on the agenda for Thursday. Oh, great. Thank you. Excuse me.
One more thing.
Oh, yeah.
I know
sure.
Rick had some numbers that showed the way things worked out, but did you have a comparison of what we do now, and then with the fifth, what would it be, and it escalates?
That's embedded in this.
Oh, it is? Okay. I didn't get a chance to.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. All right. What? Well, going once, going twice?
I don't think.
George, thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming, too. You're welcome. Oh, John? You were done.
So that was right.
What's the need to bring it up again?
Okay.
Well, I'm going to send something in writing to the Board of Selectmen and be prepared to speak on the 19th what the committee's position is. And at this point, I'm not sure what it is. So we have time to think about it, and we'll articulate our ideas on Thursday, and then go from there.
So the 19th is a fixed point in time.
That's correct. Does that make sense? Now, that being said, I'm open to suggestions. I'm just trying to put the easiest way.
Well, my issue is simply that the longer you delay on something like this, the more you delay, the worse it gets. So, there is, in my view, if the deal is a good deal, then, or a reasonable deal, let's put it that way.
Okay.
Then you don't want to delay it any more than you have to.
Yeah, when you say delay, at the 19th, the board is voting on it, so.
Okay, and that's what I wanted to get straight. You're saying that's a fixed point in time.
That's a fixed point in time. So we have until between now and then to articulate our comments and our position.
Yeah.
And so, and my idea, the thought, there's a second, the thought was that on Thursday, everybody's had a chance to think about it, we'll articulate some ideas, we can take a motion, and then I'll be able to formulate something in writing and also be prepared to speak at the Board of Selectmen meeting. Kristen?
Yeah, I'd like to take a few days just to absorb.
Yeah.
And there was a lot, and I think we can reread, George's presentation. I think things will make a lot more sense, and so I think
That's the idea.
Would be
Instead
nice.
of deciding today. So then Thursday, I think, with enough time. Okay? All right, so I think we're all set on this agenda item. And Martin, we'll put this on for Thursday, continuation of this? Great. All right. And if there are any other questions, George, I will contact you. Great, appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, George.
Have a good afternoon. Safe traveling. Okay. Next item is discussion regarding additional potential duties and responsibilities of the Finance Committee. And as you may recall, a few members had some questions about what our duties and responsibilities were, and so I contacted John, about a month ago, and about this, and so just to, this is your opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion, and John, I don't know if you wanted to just have anything to say before taking any questions? Oh, please, go ahead. Yeah, that's great.
Wasn't this right now? This is about all software.
So,
Part of it, a little more than that, making the.
So, Mr. Chairman, in my travels around the Commonwealth, I deal with a lot of towns, of course, and a lot of finance committees, and I have to say that, there are different models out there in terms of how active finance committees are, and there are basic two parameters here. One is, what is your legal authority? And that's typically determined by the bylaws that the town has enacted when the Finance Committee was first set up. And then there's more, in addition to sort of the legal authority, then there's the question of how proactive does a Finance Committee think it needs to be, and that's oftentimes a reflection of how well the town is run, and to some extent it depends upon how the Finance Committee is appointed. But I would say that the model that I've observed in Nantucket up until now is pretty typical, and that is the role of the Finance Committee is really most prevalent during what I call town meeting season, and that's what we're here tonight to do. And of course, you make all the motions, the initial motions at town meeting, and I would say play a very active role in the fiscal affairs of the town. The other item that of course you do is keep governance over the reserve fund, and making decisions throughout the year in terms of whether or not to approve extraordinary and unforeseen expenditures. But I think it's probably instructive to go to your bylaw itself.
Which is on our page.
And I'm looking at section 11-4 of the town code,
Okay.
which says, the duties of the Finance Committee shall be to, A, thoroughly investigate all articles on the warrant of annual and special town meetings, and to have its decision of recommendations or disapproval printed after the article so investigated on said warrant, and said recommendations to appear in some medium of general circulation in Nantucket. So obviously, the way you do that here is, at the time that the motion book is put together, there's a Finance Committee recommendation on most articles. Tradition here has been that when you get to zoning articles, you defer to the recommendation of the Planning Board, and that is very, very typical from what I see. So basically you're following the requirement of the bylaw. It doesn't limit your ability to make recommendations on just financial articles. You could, if you chose, make recommendations, for example, on zoning, if you felt there was a need or a void to fill. Section B says this Finance Committee duties include investigate the expenditures of any monies by the town officials and notify the Board of Selectmen in writing as to whether or not, in its opinion, the expenditure is or was justified. And there's a general provision in the general laws that authorizes finance committees to make inquiries into the financial affairs of the town. And I've certainly seen in extraordinary circumstances a finance committee might take a more active role if there's a concern about a particular expenditure of funds. Right. I would point out, though, that under the law, the town accountant, believe it or not, when he or she reviews all of the warrants for payment, is supposed to certify that the goods and services were delivered and that the proper laws were followed. And I've certainly seen circumstances where the town accountant has refused to sign off on a warrant for payment. For example, where proper public bidding procedures were not followed. So there is that provision embedded in the general laws, and there's a town official who's specifically empowered to disapprove expenditures if there was not compliance with the law. And that applies not only to general government, but to the school committee as well. Okay. So your bylaw doesn't permit the finance committee to disapprove an expenditure. As I said, if it did, it would be actually inconsistent with state law, which leaves that up to the town accountant. But you can certainly make inquiry. And I believe a good example, if I'm not mistaken, was when we had the issues with the airport.
The paving subcommittee.
The Finance Committee produced a report.
That's correct.
And then there was a subsequent audit conducted by the Markham Group. But I think that was a good example of where there's an extraordinary circumstance. Certainly the Finance Committee has the ability to step in and make a report.
Okay.
And then you have a specific provision about the Capital Program Committee that basically empowers the Finance Committee to step into the role of that committee if they fail to act. Mm-hmm. That's unique to Nantucket. And then finally, 11-5 just reiterates the reserve fund jurisdiction and your ability to determine whether, in approving a request for a reserve fund transfer, you think it's an extraordinary or unforeseen event. So that's in a nutshell what your powers and duties are, and it's up to you to exercise them within the parameters of the bylaw.
Well, that certainly is very helpful for review. A question that I have is it will go back to zoning. In one specific instance, a very narrow view is that there is a citizen warrant article about changing some zoning issues on Old South Road for development. And it's been brought up by members of this committee, is that should we take a role in looking at that, but just from financial implications of these. And the question was brought up is that, I think I know the answer, but I'll ask it, are we, within what you just discussed, within our purview to look into those matters?
Mr. Chairman, I think you are. I don't think there's anything in the bylaw that limits the authority of the Finance Committee to make recommendations on warrant articles. I would point out, as I think I mentioned earlier, that it's, I've seen it both ways.
Okay.
But obviously, you have a planning board. Now, one thing town meeting cannot do is act on a zoning article without a report and recommendation of the planning board, generally speaking. So if they can recommend against it, and town meeting can still vote, but the question is you need a report and recommendation to act in the first instance. There's obviously no similar provision for the Finance Committee, just a general ability to comment on warrant articles.
Right.
And that really is up to the committee to decide whether or not you want to proceed down what I would say is a different path than the way you've operated.
Okay. All right. Very good. John, then Kristen.
Yeah, and that was, I was one of the people that felt that was something that should be brought up. because the issue is the planning board typically does not, they do a good job, but they typically do not look at the financial implications
That's not their statute.
of what they do. And there are some of the things that they do have financial implications, this being a very good example.
Yes, it is. That's correct. Christie?
John, is it in the Finance Committee's purview to can they make a motion on a zoning article, or is that strictly reserved for planning? And if they can, how does that take precedent when it's at town meeting? Which is, because as long as I've been on the committee, I can't remember making having the Finance Committee make a motion on a zoning article, maybe a comment at some point or another, but if the Finance Committee can make a motion on a zoning article, how does that sort of piggyback with
Well, I believe your bylaws are silent on that particular issue. It's certainly, we have to look at custom and practice. And the custom and practice here has been that the Finance Committee makes the main motion, if you will, on just about every article except zoning. And that's typically made by the planning board. But any registered voter of the town can make a motion, and there's nothing that says, for example, that the Finance Committee has to make all main motions at town meeting. But that is certainly the custom and the tradition, and I think certainly with respect to financial articles, it's supported by the plain language of your bylaw. I would, you don't want to get into a turf battle here, and that's just going to lead to all sorts of hard feelings and chaos and everything else. I would say that if the Finance Committee felt strongly about a particular zoning article and because of the financial implication, that you could certainly make a recommendation to town meeting. That's not the same as making the main motion, though.
You make a comment.
You could make a comment.
Okay.
You could make a comment in the warrant, in the motion book, even though you're not actually making the motion itself.
Okay. And I think that's important, just a second, Craig, I think that's important, because that's what I was envisioning if we are going to weigh in on any zoning, is being a form of a comment. Craig?
I think you were in favor here, that?
I did.
Well, Craig, go ahead.
Well, is yours on zoning?
Well, the same topic. John, the Civic League sponsored a discussion with the developer of the Old South Road property. That's a citizens article for town meeting. And the topic of impact fees, financial impact fees, came up. And the developer right there said we would be, we would entertain, or we would, be willing to talk about whatever those fees are. And Andrew Vorse said, well, we've never charged those in the past. So there, I think it gets back to what John said. It's, the planning really doesn't get into kind of the financial side, where here's a case where the developer, he wants to have the deal happen, and if we can identify that there is going to be additional fees as a result of this, that the developer's willing to pay those fees. It seems like planning is not, because they haven't done it in the past, it's sort of not something they've...
Well, I would first of all caution you against using the term fees in that context. I mean, maybe the developer used that term, but as you know, fees are a very specific animal under the law. What I have seen done in the past is if a developer is willing to come forward and voluntarily offer mitigation to the town in connection with a particular project, unless your bylaw actually empowers the planning board to negotiate those kinds of deals, and typically they don't, it would be something for the Board of Selectmen, as the chief executive officer of the town, to get involved. Now, that doesn't mean the Finance Committee couldn't make a recommendation, but the Finance Committee, it's important to realize, you have no inherent authority to enter into contracts or written agreements with anybody. The selectmen do, of course, the town manager does, and if the bylaw provides, then perhaps the planning board. But typically, the way that works is the chief executive officer of the town would negotiate some kind of a mitigation agreement, which would go hand in hand with the issuance of permits.
Tim? Sorry.
John, I have one question for you that's a little outside of the zoning or town meeting
Yep.
forum, but as you well know, there's been a lot of discussion with regard to erosion on the east end of Nantucket.
Yes.
And
I haven't heard about that.
I know. Well, I saw it in Vanity Fair, I think. Anyway, there was some kind of talk on this board about same issue. The lack of action could have financial implications on the town with regard to the roadway, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there was some discussion amongst some or all at different times about that's a role that the Finance Committee's never played before. There isn't a town meeting to comment necessarily. Would that be within our purview as a committee to maybe testify before the Conservation Commission, even though their role is different than ours, that there are these issues that are going to affect somebody? We weren't sure, so I guess we would be looking to your wisdom on that.
Well, again, it was up to the Board of Selectmen to negotiate, if you will, that memorandum of understanding that did deal with the financial aspects, first and foremost, of that project.
Right.
And there were lots of provisions in that agreement for financial assurances and protections. I think that if you're talking about presenting something to the Conservation Commission, my recommendation would be that's really not the appropriate forum, if you will, to talk about some of those financial concerns, because the Conservation Commission, in issuing orders of condition, first and foremost, have to implement the requirements of the Wetlands Protection Act and the local bylaw, and those are environmental issues which, with all due respect, the Finance Committee doesn't have any particular expertise on. I think if you felt the need to comment on a matter pending before the selectmen, i.e. the MOU, then that would be a different story. I think reading the bylaw, I think you certainly have that ability to make recommendations.
Okay. Makes
I
sense.
appreciate that.
Yeah, that helps. John, did you have a question?
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
It's getting late.
Okay. Steve?
John, when I was at the Civic League Forum with respect to the Old South Road proposed development, there was a question asked of the developer. Would he be amenable to an amendment to what I believe is a citizen warrant article regarding the lifting of the building cap for 2 parcels of land, or effectively for 2 parcels of land? There are others, but wouldn't be affected based on ground cover issues. And the developer said that he would not, in part because he believed it would violate state zoning law with respect to spot zoning.
Uniformity, right? Yep.
Right. So, given that was that this proposed warrant article is a citizen warrant article, and I believe you reviewed them all before we saw them, was that something that you looked at? Does this proposed article, the way it encompasses 17 parcels and effectively 2 parcels, does that not constitute spot zoning?
Well, when we conduct our review, there's really a different approach between citizens' articles and articles that are proposed by the planning board. Although, when I conduct my review of citizens' articles, I'm constantly aware of those kinds of issues. Spot zoning is something that's very difficult to analyze, but it typically is a situation where a zoning amendment is focused on a private benefit to an individual. The smaller the parcel, the fewer the number of lots. If it's isolated, it's called spot zoning for a reason. It's a spot in the middle of some other zoning district. But there is always a presumption that if the planning board recommends this and if town meeting votes it, there's a presumption of regularity, and it would be up to someone opposed to the amendment to challenge it either before the Attorney General or in court on a spot zoning claim. But again, the larger the number of parcels, the size of what's the area to be rezoned, is it consistent with surrounding land use patterns, those are all elements that would go into that kind of an analysis. So when I looked at that, I didn't see anything that jumped out at me as say, oh my God, spot zoning. I did not see that.
Okay. What would be the town's exposure if somebody were to challenge the passage of the warrant article based on spot zone?
Well, the first and foremost, a zoning amendment, when it's passed, has to be submitted to the Attorney General for approval. And I have seen the Attorney General's office disapprove bylaws based upon lack of uniformity in the district. I'm not sure I've ever seen one on spot zoning, but the same kinds of issues. And it depends. In that circumstance, I would take my direction from the Board of Selectmen and from the Planning Board. If it's something that the town felt very strongly about, then we would write a letter. I just did this 2 weeks ago. I did that in another community, and we were able to successfully defeat a challenge before the Attorney General, and the bylaw was approved. Now, once the bylaw is approved and it goes into effect, then somebody would have to challenge it in court. And again, that would be up to the selectmen to give us direction, depending upon the town's interest in seeing that bylaw upheld. And typically, if town meeting votes for it, there's a presumption that it should be upheld. I don't see, other than the legal fees, I don't see much exposure.
Okay.
Basically, it would be the bylaw is disapproved.
Right.
Tim?
John, are impact fees against state law?
It depends. How's that for an answer? They have to be extremely narrowly tailored. And there's lots of case law out there, so you have to make sure that they're done properly. I can't say that they're illegal.
For the most part, though?
Well, you just have to be really careful, and I would want to answer that in the context of a specific proposed bylaw.
So we'll stay away from that term. Okay. Any other questions? Very helpful. Thank you. We'll see, and we'll see you on April 5th. Always. Okay. Let's see. Why don't we, in light of, well, let's see. We will defer approval of minutes to a later meeting. Any committee reports? I have none. Go through that. Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Not yet. Date of next meeting, buddy. Date of next meeting. Date of next meeting is tomorrow, February 11th, at 4:15 at the middle school cafeteria, and we will be discussing zoning. And so everyone, and real estate, so everybody have their questions ready. And
Did you say zoning and real estate?
well, zoning, we have 2 days set aside for it, so it's on the agenda.
Yep.
Okay. So with that in mind, now I will ask for a motion for adjournment.
Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay. Everybody have a nice evening. All right. Hand them over. You rake.
Big ones.
A lot of time with those numbers.